Hello. Hi, everyone. So, Prague is very different from Berlin, and as you know, in Berlin, the I would say the maximum number of Russian immigrants was in early 1922, 1923, and it would be maximum 700,000 Russian immigrants. Imagine that figure. It would eventually drop to like 400,000, but there's a lot. But Prague is very different. So Prague provided the shelter for up to 40,000 Russians, but it was still quite a lot. This is the video I've also found on YouTube of Prague of approximately 1920s. It was colorized, so you can see that. And well, Prague is much smaller, and the Czech Republic was also kind of a newly born state. Czechoslovakia, actually. So it was the new country that was also trying to recuperate after the First World War, and the Czech Republic, the Czech country and the Slovakia, they were also involved um, in the Austro-Hungarian armies and everything. So the world was definitely coming back to senses after the First World War, and the Czech Republic decided to help the Russian immigrants provide for them the place, well, for life, for studies, but for just certain groups. Those were either students or scholars. Unlike Turkey, unlike Germany, unlike France, which will be the next tour about. We'll be talking about France. There's definitely going to be more than one episode. There's also a lot to talk about, not just Russian taxi drivers. No, there's a lot more than that. Also, a lot of spies, abductions, murders, sex scandals, many things. I haven't scheduled this episode yet, but I will shortly, so you don't want to miss that. Definitely. So, but Prague was aiming at something different, not politicians, no, only young people of the like student age and scholars and scientists. They also provided um, all sorts of scholarships and a lot of financial support. So that was the act of absolutely incredible generosity, and obviously many, not that many people could. I mean, compared to the big number of oh, 700,000 compared to 40,000, it's not really much, but it's also to understand that the Czech Republic, it was Czechoslovakia was sorry, I keep saying Czech Republic, but it's Czechoslovakia. I keep well forgetting that and keep confusing that. So Prague and Czechoslovakia was a much smaller country than Germany. That's also important to understand. And speaking of some Georgians who would go there, I would like to speak about the two people. And these two people, they were of a quite different, I would say, approach. For example, Spiridon Kedia was a journalist and he was a researcher. He lived in Prague for several years. He was a Georgian scholar and a journalist. He fled to Georgia not after 1917. Georgians would flee to from Georgia after 1921, after the Bolsheviks invaded Tiflis and the entire country basically. So it's not correct to say that Spiridon Kidia was the representative of the white Russian immigration movement, but he definitely fled from the same threat from the Bolsheviks anyway. So that's white immigration is just a generalization. It's not the most correct term, but we stick to it because it's easier. So Spiridon Kedia he published some research papers, but eventually he moved. Spiridon Kedia is remembered, by the way, in Georgia, and a lot of those representatives of Georgian in Georgian Republic, because after 1918, Georgia got independence, and the Georgian Democratic Republic was proclaimed. So Spiridon Kedia was a big activist, and he wasn't a politician, because politicians were not really welcomed in Prague. He was a journalist, but he was a big supporter, an avid supporter of Georgian community, and there were a lot of young Georgians who enrolled in the Czechoslovakian universities, and he was one of the, so to speak, mentors for many of those students. He also was in charge of the Georgian student organization. Obviously, there were a lot of student communities. Russians had their own communities, and obviously Czechs and Slovaks had their own student communities. And uh, this would be he would be the head of the Georgian student community. And obviously, because he was kind of his community was sort of a hub. Yes, I don't mean to say that that Prague prohibited politicians, Bolshevik opponents to visit. Obviously not. They were allowed, and there were a lot of gatherings, and a lot of leaders of those exiles of Georgian Democratic or former Georgian Democratic Republic would be coming to Prague, and some students would be joining them and would be following them. Some would follow them and move to Berlin, but most Georgians eventually flocked to Paris. That's because the powers, obviously the main powers of Georgian resistance, they eventually went to Paris. So in Paris, they had their own hub in a way. So, but another person who spent some time in Prague but left Prague exactly because he was not a student, he was not a scholar, he was a politician, and a very famous one, Irakli Tsereteli. Irakli Tsereteli, he became quite well known way before the Russian Revolution. In fact, he was the Georgian representative in the Duma. He was the Russian representative and Georgian representative in the provisional government after the 1917 revolution, after the abdication of Nicholas II. So the first revolution that happened in spring 1917, the provisional government was created, and he, together with Kerensky, who was the head of the provisional government, he was there giving speeches. He was present at every gathering, and Kedia, you wouldn't believe it, Kedia was the one who said a very big phrase, that a very important phrase. I I'm gonna I'm not quoting, but it's something very close to the what he originally said. That so he claimed, he was sure that there wouldn't be any party that would be able to seize power by force. And he was sure that the new form of government would be found when the Constituent Assembly would gather in the beginning of 1918. And a few months after that was said by Tsereteli, Bolsheviks seized power, and Tsereteli had to flee. This photo, by the way, was taken before the revolution. He was arrested several times before the provisional government. So before many events, he was arrested, and this photo was taken in the Metehi political prison, the place that I show on many of my tours in Tbilisi. At the very heart of Tbilisi, there is a church which stands on the place from where the history of the city started. And in the Bolshevik times, and in the let's say in the pre-revolutionary times and in the Bolshevik times, there was a political prison there, and it's hard to believe it. Yeah, but there was a prison in the very heart of the city, and yes, there were executions. People were shot to death there in the heart of the city, and everyone who lived in that neighborhood, they heard the gunshots and screams. Yeah, that's horrible. So, but Tsereteli wasn't killed, and Tsereteli managed to escape to Georgia, and then he escaped to Europe, just like everyone else. But so Tsereteli was not a fighter against the monarchy, right? He was a he fought basically for independence of Georgia. Yeah, but obviously that couldn't save him from the Bolsheviks. And had he stayed in Tiflis, Tbilisi, he would have been killed like 100%. So he fled. And he spent some time in Prague. He would go visit also the students. That's, by the way, the thought of the provisional government. I'm sure he's somewhere there, but I couldn't find him easily. So you can have some fun later on watching the recording and trying to pinpoint Teddy Teddy. But he would be talking to students, and then he would go to Paris, and some students eventually would follow him. So we talk more about the Georgian resistance and what happened to the Georgian resistance members and how they eventually would decide to go back and what would happen to them in Georgia. We'll talk about it, but later. So now we are focusing on Prague and on the student years and the student communities in Prague, first and foremost. So you can see some photos. It's all taken from open sources. There's a lot of information, by the way, about it, but you really need to know where to look for it altogether. So there was some absolutely unbelievable sum of money that was given by the Czechoslovakian government to help the Russian immigrants. The approximate conversion makes it $38 million for altogether like 40,000 students, well, 40,000 immigrants, most of whom were students. That's well, no other country provided such a financial aid to Russian immigrants. They provide, okay, obviously there was a lot given in Istanbul. I'm not talking about the money given also for the army. That's a bit different, right? We're talking about just people who were not related to the army at all. That's quite a lot. The question is, where did the money come from? That's a very good question. And how did the Czechoslovak government let that happen? And was it the initiative of the government of Czechoslovakia? Yes. This is Thomas Masaryk. I think Thomas Masaryk. He was the president of Czechoslovakia immediately after the um, immediately after the First World War finished. And Thomas Masaryk spoke Russian, and he knew a lot of the members of the former provisional government in person. By the way, the prime minister of Czechoslovakia also spoke Russian. So it was 100% the initiative of Czechoslovak government to provide students places, to provide financial aid and education to Russian people. Why? Was it just because they were so kind? Well, they were. But the idea was that they would be, nourishing. That's, by the way, him and I believe some Russian general. He looks like Denikin, but I'm not entirely sure. But we know that Denikin, who was the commander in chief of one of the divisions of the White Russian Army, they were quartered in Novorossiysk, and then they also had to flee through Turkey, and so and then to elsewhere in Europe. So the idea was that those young people would get education. And then the idea was that everyone at that time in 1920s, everyone was sure that the Bolshevik state would fail, that the Bolshevik state would collapse at any moment. So the idea was that the Czechoslovak government was hoping that by the time these young people would graduate, and become educated liberals, kind of. Uh, they would be able to go back to their homeland, free the country from the Bolshevism, and cooperate with Europe and with Czechoslovakia and establish good diplomatic relations. There was a very there was a very good thinking, definitely, like looking for many years forward. Unfortunately, as you know, the Bolsheviks, by the way, that's the members of a Czechoslovakian government with some Russian immigrants. Unfortunately, as you know, the Bolshevik government stayed for a little longer than everyone was hoping for. So, yeah, that's never really worked out the way Masaryk really planned it. But okay, anyway, where did the money come from? Was it the money from the Czechoslovakian taxpayers? And mind you, this is just several years after the First World War was over. That that wasn't possible. So that's an interesting story. I did definitely talk about a thing called the Kolchak's gold. Obviously, I don't expect you to remember that. So there was a so-called Kolchak's gold, and the legend is it used to be thought for a long time that the money that the Czechoslovak government provided to Russian students were originally coming from the Kolchak gold, which we now understand was not exactly the true. So let me explain. I'll try to cut to the chase. So you may have heard of a Czechoslovak Legion who was formed in the First World War times from Czechs and Slovaks. So they were divisions of the Austro-Hungarian army in the First World War. And as a result, this Czechoslovak Legion was taken as prisoners of war, and eventually they ended up in the east of Russia. Um, you may have for especially my European audience and Eastern European audience, you may have heard of the Legio Bank in Prague. There's a gorgeous Art Nouveau building. So it was established by those survivors of those Czechoslovakian Legion. So this is the photo of the Czechoslovakian Legion. So they were basically prisoners of war, and then they were involved in the White Army movement when the White Army was pushed by Linda. Thank you so much for the tips. When the army was pushed by the Red Army, so basically White Army, Red Army, that's the juxtaposition, that's the conflict. So they would be retracting to more to the east, more to the east, and but the White Army by that time had been able to capture um, some parts of the golden reserve of the country, which before that had been evacuated from Moscow to Kazan. From Kazan, the White Army managed to take parts of the gold reserve to almost in Siberia. And this is when the Czechoslovak Legion was joined to the White Army. So they had part of the golden reserve. Altogether, the golden reserve to again, if you convert it to modern days, those were dozens of billions of dollars. I mean, dozens of billions of dollars. It's not like this much. I mean, it's not the it's not the GDP of a country. But I mean, but anyway, that was a lot of money, and it was in cash, gold reserve. In Kazan, Bolsheviks managed to capture half of it. Then gold was taken to Omsk, Siberia, White Army, Czechoslovak Legion, but eventually, the Bolsheviks chased them, and so the White Army was caught. The the commander in chief of the White Army, Kolchak, eventually was taken captive. He was betrayed. That's a long story. I'm not going into it now. So eventually, the Czechoslovak Legion was offered a very good deal. So that's Kolchak. So they were given a chance to leave Russia, but they had to leave the gold reserve in Russia, obviously. They were just offered to leave. No, and so the Bolshevik told them they would provide them with a train, they would give them some money. The rest of the gold in the reserve was supposed to be given to the Bolsheviks. So that's the photo from Kazan city, 1918. It's cold. It's only part of it. It's not even all of it. Imagine. So, and that's how eventually the Czechoslovak Legion survived. That's the train. So they returned to Czechoslovakia and they established as heroes, basically as the survivors. They established that there was a big community. They established a bank, and for a long time it was believed that the money of the Czechoslovak Legion was stored in the bank, and those were the money that they took from the gold reserve. But we know now it is, I guess it's the historians are pretty much unanimous about it that those were, if there even was, some gold reserve that they somehow managed to keep to themselves, it was very, I mean, negligible sum of money. So the bank is still there, the building is still there. I'm not sure whether it's there's still this kind of a Legio bank, but the building is there. I haven't been to Prague, unfortunately, but now I so even more want to go there to see all these places with my own eyes. That's the photo from 1920s, and you can trace the history of the Czechoslovak Legion in Russia just on the facade. Russian bears, Siberian people. They were in Siberia, really, not far from where I was born. And well, all these hardships that they had to face. Yeah. So anyway, um, this is just the interiors of the Legio Band building now, taken from the internet. A gorgeous building, absolutely gorgeous. But now we know that most likely the money will be coming from Nadezhda Abrikosova, a very Russian name. By the way, Nadezhda Abrikosova was married, well, she was married twice. First husband was from the Abrikosov family, and it was one of the richest men in the country, in Russia. So she was from Russia. He was the chocolate king of Russia. And that's how she got her money after the divorce. So when she was still married to her first husband, she fell in love with Karol Kramarz. I hope I pronounce his name right. I'm sorry for this in advance. Karol Kramarz uh, eventually would be the prime minister of Czechoslovakia, but when he visited Moscow, he was a businessman. And he was introduced to the Abrikosov family, and he was introduced to the Abrikosova, and this is how these little by little all decided to see each other. Then they had some sort of a romance in letters. They were like 10 friends with benefits, and then she divorced Abrikosov shortly before the revolution, and then she left, and she had a lot of money with her. And Kramarz, because before becoming a prime minister, he was a businessman, a very well-to-do businessman. So it is now believed, it wasn't really told openly, but at least half, maybe even more, and maybe even all the money would be coming from this family, from Nadezhda Abrikosova and Karol Kramarz. They had zillions of money. That's also her. So that's and because Kramarz and Masaryk, well, they were not exactly Russophiles. No, it's not really so, but um they they had this vision that these young people would be the future, and it would grant really good and prosperous future for the partnership of the future state of Russia without Bolsheviks and Czechoslovakia. So that was the idea. And well, we know that that didn't really work this way, but at that point, everyone thought the Bolshevik state wouldn't last for longer than several years. And the students, those people who studied in at universities, they, well, you wouldn't believe it, but there would be a law department, and those Russian students, there was even a subject, the laws of the uh, Russian Empire. These people studied the law of the country that no longer existed. Huh? So where did they live? They lived in dorms. There's a term for it in the Czech language, svobodarna. That's kind of a dorm for a single men and women, and that's where they lived in Svobodarna. This is the building. The building is still there. Nothing spectacular in the area, really far from the downtown, far from the universities. Sorry. Back then it was one tram, like 40 minutes on tram, and then 40 minutes on foot. So that's how far it was from the downtown. Again, I haven't been there. I just read it from the memoirs. And that was just one place where they lived. There wasn't really a lot of privacy, I would say, but there were a lot of rooms, like the room for reading, uh, for some like playing some games, for studying, some library. It was just a lot of room for gatherings, so to speak. And there are a lot of photographs. There was not really, so there was scholarship, but it was like twice as less from the, I would say, the minimum wage. So it wasn't really a lot, but it was something. There was another dorm in the downtown of Prague. This one is called Chodobice, and it was built in the Austro-Hungarian times. Quite a spectacular building, but that definitely fits the Austro-Hungarian vibe. And it was the dorm for the homeless. It was just a home for the homeless, and that's where the Russian immigrants would be staying. This is the photo from approximately the same period. There was also a, some free meals were given, and obviously the students would be given free meals. So Hudobinet, that's the name. I hope I pronounced it right. The photo was taken of, well, at that time. So universities, obviously, well, we know that Charles University or Karlov University in Prague is the well-known educational facility, and up until the Russian invasion in Ukraine, there were a lot of Russian students there. I myself could have been studying there. I mean, I could have studied there back in the days, but eventually my parents decided not to send me anywhere. So it could have been very different. But anyway, so there I know a lot of my fellow students from my university studied and graduated from Charles University, and we know that Charles University is a very good university, and there were a lot of Russian students there that they would study there and all around the city on different departments. However, when it gets like medical departments, there was there was a restriction. Russian students would be given this medical education, but they would not be allowed to work to practice as doctors in Prague, in Czechoslovakia in general. That was the restriction. Yes. So that was a bit of a useless education, but they could practice elsewhere in Europe. So, but now let's talk about, okay, but what was the legal status? So were the students automatically given some sort of a residence, or how was that? There were several options, and you didn't have to be a student, by the way. So that, the League of Nations came up with this, eventually they were, well, this is when, thanks to the Russian immigrant movement in general, this is when, the first committees to support the immigrants were established. We know that from the previous, there was exactly thanks to Russian immigration, wave of Russian immigration. This is when the first committee dealing with refugees would be established in Europe, exactly after the Russian Revolution. Fridtjof Nansen, who is well known for two things. Well, Fridtjof Nansen is known for his exploration of the North, and yes, he was only like 400 kilometers away of something from the North Pole, but so he's known for his expedition. So he also is famous for the his political career and for the implementation of the so-called Nansen passport. So the passports for refugees, so to speak. And Czechoslovakia also recognized Nansen passport, and this was an option. And you didn't have to be a student actually. And the Nansen passport was recognized all across Europe. It would take uh, it would uh, it would take some time to arrange that, but eventually it would be given to many Russian immigrants across Europe, and not only Russian immigrants in general. Nansen passport is it's an interesting story in general, and that's what it looked like. It's just a photo from Wikipedia, but there were other options too. Um, Czechoslovakian government provided the so-called prukas. It's kind of a local residence permit. This is I hope I pronounce it right. Like kind of, it's an application for a prukas, and in order to apply for prukas, you had to either be a student. So you well, students would be given the prukas, I would say, um, much quicker than, let's say, um, other people, not students, right, who also wanted to live in Prague. But as you know, the students were always in high demand and they were given a priority. So this is, by the way, the student's document of Kiryev Pyotr Petrovich, 1922, August 1922, Law Department. By the way, so that's also some documents, and that's the prukas when it was given, the certificate, the residence permit for students. So that's what it looked like. And prukas was totally valid. You could work with it officially. You could pay taxes with it officially, anything. So you would be given basically all the rights and and benefits, and where would you apply for it? You would first go to the Palace Hotel. Yes, Russian immigrants would go there not just not to stay in the hotel, but it was a headquarter of the Zemgor Commission. Zemgor Commission was exactly in charge of providing support, and also the Prukas distribution for Russian immigrants. And if Zemgor gave approval to the Prukas, to a certain student, this person, mostly student, but there were also other groups, they would go to the Russian embassy. Well, it's the former Russian embassy, but it was the place where the Prukas would be given, so to speak. That's the caricature, and it says Malenia Aprukas. You're like praying to Aprukas. It's kind of a caricature because in general, in this building, in this former embassy building, this is where the final decision would be given, whether you are given Prukas or not. And speaking of students, I guess I just happily forgotten about the Q&A, and I guess we'll just have a Q&A in the end. I hope that's okay with you. Sorry, I just got carried away with this whole thing, Kolchak gold and stuff. There are a lot of stories about the Kolchak gold. Maybe at some point I'll give a tour about that, how Kolchak was betrayed, and oh, it's a very interesting story. But anyway, so speaking of students, there was among of those 40,000 people, from whom 37,000 would be students, and then scholars and PhDs and everything. So there was one very interesting gentleman, Sergei Efron. Yes, he was a Jew. He was a writer, he was a journalist, a bit of a poet, and well, he was quite talented and famous. But his wife was even more famous. And she would become eventually famous all around the Russian-speaking world. Was a poet, Marina Tsvetaeva, who is considered one of the biggest poets of the 20th century in Russia. This is the photo of them colorized in the happy times, I would say. They were both from well-to-do families. And for example, the Marina Tsvetaeva's father was the one who established the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, which is the Hermitage level museum in Moscow, basically. And Efron was coming from a merchant family, very well-to-do family, well, Jewish merchants in Moscow. So um, he after the First World War, he escaped obviously to Turkey, and that's the Gallipoli camp, the one that we talked about in the first episode about Turkey. And Marina Tsvetaeva stayed in Moscow for some time with the two children, and she managed to leave only in like 1923. She first went to Berlin with one daughter, by the way, and she stayed in Berlin for some time, and then she managed to come to Prague. Sergei Fron chose to come to Prague because he was of the student age, and he enrolled in some philosophy department, and so he was staying, by the way, in the same Svobodarna dorm. And yeah, that's the one. And Tsvetaeva, together with the daughter, Ariadne, would be visiting him. But they couldn't stay in Svobodarna because since he wasn't single, he wasn't the only one there. They couldn't really stay in Svobodarna. So they had to find something else. And they didn't have really enough money to rent anywhere in Prague. And also, Efron had to study, and he loved his studies. He was a student of Nikodim Kondakov, who was a philosopher, and by the way, one of the outstanding philosophers of the turn of the 20th century, and also of the Russian immigration. He was like a mainstream philosopher, and he was a scholar. He wasn't just a philosopher; he was a scholar. He had a PhD. So when he came to Prague already a highly respected scholar, and he was a professor. He taught. He wasn't a student. He taught at this university, and he was so well respected, and he gained so much recognition and pop. And by the way, that's Efron. I could easily find him. He was so respected and he got so popular among the students that Prague University, that Prague government even created, even there was even given a building for his courses. It's the building is still there. The old name is Kondakovian, and as far as I understand, the building it's still referred as the Kondakovian building. So Efron couldn't just leave his studies, and if he left, he wouldn't he wouldn't be getting his scholarship. So that's why they would be like they would have to separate. Then eventually, after Efron graduated, he would move together with Tsvetaeva to a place not far from Prague, but they just couldn't really afford staying anywhere closer to Prague or in the city. So Masaryk and Kondakov, they encouraged not I mean not Kondakov, Masaryk and Kramarz, so the president and the prime minister, um, it was their initiative of the Czechoslovakian government to establish this Kondakovian. It, it's not like it's not a university, it's not a department. It's kind of a kind of a student community center, I would say. So Efron was a bright student of Kondakov, so he couldn't really leave him. But eventually, they moved to I not place not far from Prague. You can't find. I just the name really slipped my mind. It's not far from Prague. It's like 40 minutes by train from Prague. They rented this house, part of the house, not the entire house. And there is a memorial plaque on this house. This house is still there. So 1923, 1924, they stayed in this house, and then they would also switch to some other places. And eventually they would move. But while they stayed in Prague, Tsvetaeva wrote hundreds of poems, hundreds of poems. She loved Prague a lot. She loved Berlin too, but Prague is also the place where she fell in love with someone else. Yeah, she was never really the most faithful woman, but she was a poet. So anyway, and she was in love with Prague. So maybe she also had an affair with Prague. And I really like her Prague poems because she's very happy there, and it's still before the times of Great Depression. It's still the times before the great grief in her family, which I will talk about on my Paris tours. I'm not going to talk about it now. And Prague is just a beautiful city. I mean, you cannot really argue with that. So she was inspired, and there are several places in Prague that still remember Marina Tsvetaeva. She's remembered there. That's the photo of Ariadne and Tsvetaeva in Prague, by the way. There's some photos taken. There is a poem to the night on the bridge, on Charles Bridge. Well, I'll just read a little bit of it, but it's a big poem and it's a very good poem. I love it so much. Pale faced, a sentinel above the century's flesh, night on night, guarding the river's dash, till I find in her peace from lips and hands, watchmen standing on the post of parting lands. To water entries free, let roses bloom and birth. He cast me off, I'll cast myself in first. Well, it's just the beginning. It's a translation I found online, so it's not a bad one, definitely. And I like really the last lines of it. Sweetness and sorrow in her, you know best. Night who guards the river, days at rest. So she worked there gazillion of times. Unlike Efron, she wasn't a student, so she had all the time she had, and she would just take the train and go to Prague and wander the streets and write poems. So those were happy years. Those were definitely their third son, by the way, was born in Prague. Unfortunately, everyone in this photo ended up very, very bad, but we will talk about it later, not now. There's another place where Marina Tsvetaeva is still remembered. That's the Slavia restaurant or cafe, Slavia. That's it. It's just the photos from the internet. And Marina, the first place Marina was taken to was the Slavia cafe. And this is basically the place, if you have been to Prague, you could have been there. This is the kind of the hub of writers and creative class people. There are a lot of gatherings this used to be arranged from what I gathered from the internet. And Tsvetaeva there are photographs of different writers and artists that were frequent in this cafe. They're there on the walls, and there is a photo of Marina Tsvetaeva too. There you go. So it was the first place where she was invited to when she came to Prague. And she liked it in Slavia very much, very much. And from Slavia Cafe, you could also see the mountain. the new bridge and the mountain. And needless to say that she wrote a poem to the mountain too. The mountain was like the chest of a record struck by a shell. That mountain longed for lips, virgin lips, for a wedding spell. Like mountain may demand, like an ocean bursting in to the shell of the ear unplanned, that mountain fought and sinned. Oh, so I believe that the Prague poems are my favorite of Marina Tsvetaeva. I'm a big fan of the Russian Silver Age literature, which is the years, let's say, uh, from early 1900s to the revolution. So this is kind of, it's already not the Silver Age because the country was no longer there, but this is the immigrants literature, and that's a bit different kind of literature with a lot of longing for home, but also it's very romantic for some time. And then it would be a lot about the disillusionment and shattered dreams. But later, in the early 1920s, it was still kind of full of aspirations or wishful thinking, better say. So that's uh, this is the photo from approximately the same period. The Slavic Cafe is really not far from there. That's the new bridge and the um, um, obviously the main sites of Prague. So things were looking okay up until, well, 1930s. The financial aid would get smaller, so there would be less and less money paid. And again, it wasn't really, they didn't never really rolled in it. So in the 19 in let's say 19 in the second half of 1920s, the professors, the teachers, Russian professors, Russian teachers decided to um, unite or chip in and also build a community house for themselves. This is how it would be a lot cheaper for them to rent. They would be given well, much better salaries than students' scholarships, but it still wasn't enough. So altogether, they would build several homes, like commune houses, like that. There was just like 10% of all the money was they chipped in, the professors, and then the rest was a loan from the Czechoslovak government. And there was a community house, so to speak, that even had its church. And the head of this church, by the way, was a relative of Viktor Vasnetsov, Russian artist. Well, he managed, well, not Vasnetsov, but so his relative managed to escape. And by the way, Vasnetsov is remembered for these paintings. I spoke about it, Russian Knights and the Alyonushka. So Vasnetsov is famous for this type of paintings. And so his relative managed to escape, and he was the head of the Czechoslovakian Russian church for a long time. So there were like several community houses built, but the students still stayed in the Slobodarnas in Hudobice, and this would continue up until 1930s. In 1935, both Tomasz Masaryk, and Kramarz died, and the funding was over. And obviously, also in 19, well, further on, well, by the way, this is the funeral of Masaryk. After that, some people would move because there was no support. And then, well, let's say a lot of this, there were a lot of this Russian student communities that stayed. They still stayed because the communities were very strong. They supported each other. Obviously, professors wouldn't go anywhere. Professors continued to teach at universities, but little by little, people started to leave the country for a number of reasons. But the first one was definitely the money, and there was just less and less interest in keeping in keeping Russian students in the country, because by that time everyone had already understood that the Bolsheviks wouldn't go anywhere. And then the Nazis and the Nazis, well, shortly before Nazi invasion, a lot more people managed to flee, but some people stayed. Um, well, among those who fled would be the family of Marina Tsvetaeva and Sergei Afron and the two kids. They would go to Paris, and we'll speak more about them in the following episodes, in the upcoming episodes. Um, and well, obviously, the story of Czechoslovakia after the Second World War, well, when they were liberated by the Soviet army, so Czechoslovakia eventually, well, would be controlled by the Soviet Union, and then, well, and then, you know, the invasion of the Soviet troops in 1968, which I spoke about on my surprisingly Jewish heritage tours, right? But I would say, in general, for a long time during the Second World War, and also only after the liberation from the Soviet rule, eventually, Czech Republic started. This is from the 1968 invasion, the videos. So only in the like 90s and 2000s, the historians from Czechoslovakia, well, kind of people remembered of those times. And basically, all the information and all the photographs that we have from the Russian community in Czechoslovakia, it came from the children, the descendants of those students who I was just talking about. There is a big, there's a big community of the descendants of those Russian immigrants, but well, there are really no such institutions such as the Russian House, like there is in Berlin, and other institutions. But there is a memory. Unfortunately, there was a lot more memory, and there was a lot more research projects before Russian invasion in Ukraine. There was a big Russian community, Russian student community, and that also researched the Russian students after the revolution. But that's no longer there, unfortunately. So that's the story. Next time, I will be talking about Paris. Let's have a Q&A. The next tour is to happen in 1 hour from now. It's going to be my last tour for tonight. It's going to be about Sergei Diaghilev and his collaboration with composers, choreographers, and artists, and other interesting supporters and admirers. Thank you so much, Sharon. Thank you. I am going to share with you the link for the upcoming tour and also the tours for tomorrow, as well as all the links where you will be able to find recordings as of today and as of the previous weekend. The recordings are still there. There you go. And speaking of tomorrow, there are only 3 tours scheduled for Sunday. Saveli Sorin. Again, many of my tours are so, I would say, interconnected, because Saveli Sorin was also part of this Russian white émigré. He first moved to Tbilisi, and there will be a tour about Russian immigrants in Tbilisi. I'm not sure whether it's going to be a live walking tour or a pre-recorded, because some places I don't think will have good connectivity. So we'll get to that, but not now. So Saveli Sorin, he painted so many portraits of the former Russian aristocracy and Russian immigrants. So I cannot but talk about him, and I really want the world to know about Saveli Sorin, because he is one of those so-called kind of forgotten artists. But back in the days, in 1920s, 1930s, he got incredibly popular, and a lot of I would say royal homes in Europe, aristocrats, and his works you can find in private collections in the States too. So he was very popular artist back then, but now he's forgotten. So I want to talk more about him tomorrow. Then Misha and I will be talking about sex in the USSR, which according to the Soviet propaganda didn't exist, but well, we'll talk about it, how it existed. Yeah, and I'll be taking you to Jerusalem, obviously, for the tour on the southern wall of the Temple Mount and the western wall of the Temple Mount. So we're talking about archaeology and mostly focusing on the Second Temple period, but not only. So I know switching from sex to the Temple Mount, I know, but you know, it's okay. Thank you so much, Cindy. Uh, oh, Dolly, now I got it. So your last name comes from from Mickey, your late husband's family. Oh, I had no idea. Wow. Now I see. Thank you so much for sharing. Wow. Yes, obviously there were a lot more Jewish families. I just mentioned just several of them, and there there is a lady. She's a descendant of one of those students, and I watched the interview with her in Russian. By the way, she still speaks Russian, but she's definitely very local. She was born in Prague, so she is actually she's a Czech, obviously, but she speaks Russian very clearly without an accent, and she has a very good archive. She keeps track of all the names. She gives interviews, quite many interviews. So maybe there is a database. I don't know. Cindy, thank you so much for the coffees. Thank you, dear. So I could send you some names and some links to watch just in case. Wow, your last aunt passed away at the age of 104. Oh my goodness. So if you want to learn more about Russian immigration in Czechoslovakia, just let me know. I'll provide at least some names and send you the links for some interviews at least. And then who knows, you may want to dig a little bit deeper into that. So I don't see any more questions coming in. You have all the links. I will add more tours on my website. Also, for those who missed my tour on ballet on Leonid Massin, the recording will be available from my website. I won't be able to share it on my YouTube due to copyright issues, but from my website, you can easily find a link and it will take you to my Google Drive where you can watch the recordings. Thank you so much, Gwen. Thank you. I'm happy you enjoyed it. So next episode about Paris, definitely one of several, will be scheduled shortly. And everyone else, I will be happy to see you on my tour about Diaghilev in 1 hour from now. Thank you, Andre. Thank you so much. So I will see you very soon. Bye bye.